Welcome back to Cosmic Comics. One of the problems I've noticed with comics going digital is that one doesn't always receive the entire comic. I was rather disappointed upon purchasing a digital copy of Tales of Suspense that only one of the two stories advertised on the cover was present. Again, on Marvel Universe, the origin of the Watcher is proudly displayed on the cover, but again, the comic stops at page 13, the end of the Iron Man story. If we go back to the original comic, following this story is The Omen, a Stan Lee story about superstition on a distant planet. And then a second story by Stan Lee in Tales of the Watcher. This portion of the comic was introduced in Tales of Suspense, Volume 1, Issue number 49, whereby the Watcher shares a story with the reader, typically a short story that took place on a distant world. Often the stories would have a Twilight Zone or Outer Limits feel to them. Owning a physical copy of the comic is the only way I know to read this story. Even now, as I went to prep this video, I noticed for the first time that my copy of this comic is actually missing a full page between the Omen and the Watcher's story. I hope I didn't miss anything important, and this is an important story. This is the first time we are told how the Watchers became the Watchers. Sure, this story is told and retold and referenced time and time again over the decades in Marvel Comics, but never again is it presented in the detail found here. Let's take a look. The story opens with the Watcher observing a group of doctors performing surgery, attempting to save a man's life. As Uatu observes, he bemoans that he could help save the patient's life, but his oath of non-interference holds his hand. He's cursed to watch and record, but never take an active part in events. But then, the Watcher shares, things weren't always this way. Eons ago, the Watcher and his people lived in floating cities as part of a technologically advanced and highly civilized peoples. It was an ideal society, one that existed without war or crime. It was a point of pride that they could leave massive amounts of wealth unattended without fear of anybody taking or attempting to hoard the possessions. They had conquered all disease, and the discovery of delta ray baths led to virtual immortality. As long as they bathed at least once a century, the Watchers were kept young and spry. Both Uatu and his father Ikor were part of the High Council, their civilization's governing body, and this raises some questions. Uatu introduces his father, and we haven't seen any Lady Watchers, and the Watchers don't necessarily have to have sex in order to reproduce, but it does make me wonder what exactly is going on here. Uatu's dad makes the argument that they have so much prosperity that they should share their knowledge with those less fortunate. Emnu is the lone voice of dissent. Emnu argues that they worked hard for their achievements and that other races shouldn't be benefiting from their labor. Uatu then steps in and calls Emnu out for being selfish and seconds his father's opinion, which in turn leads to a third Watcher backing the proposal. The High World Council then decides that it is they that should personally deliver their gift of knowledge to another civilization. We are often shown the Watchers traveling through space via some kind of puffy cloud-looking ray or perhaps a spaceship, but this is perhaps the only time I can think of that we are given any kind of a clue into how their teleportation technology works. It appears to be an ability given to themselves via absorbing cosmic antimatter isotopes, and makes me wonder if they have harnessed the ability to use cosmic energy in order to impart various superpowers onto themselves, as it appears that they are doing something similar right here. After their treatments, all the Watchers have to do to travel where they want to is concentrate deeply. Their bodies transform into energy and are then directed by their own mental impulses. This manner of transportation allows the Watchers to travel at speeds close to the speed of light, and at this point in the Watchers' history, it is the fastest form of travel they have devised. As to how they eventually overcome the limitations of the speed of light when it comes to traveling the stars, remains to be seen. It took the Watchers months to reach the nearest inhabited world, Prosilica, and the Watchers seemed excited to give these primitive peoples a technological boost. The Watchers land, and upon being first seen by the Prosilicans, they assume that these alien creatures are an illusion, but the Watchers soon sort things out and make it clear that they are here to share the secret of nuclear energy. When asked what it is, the Watchers gloss over the dangers and focus on the fun stuff. Unlimited power, flying machines, almost free heating for all of your cities, and an end to disease. Upon hearing all of this, the Prosilicans were super stoked and eternally grateful for this gift from the sky. Uatu, having yet to see the fruit of their labor, is ready to start patting everybody on the back and bask in the glow of their generosity. Again, heaping praise upon his father, and digging in that even Emnu should be able to see how right his daddy was. But Emnu isn't having it, calling Uatu soft-hearted. The Watchers, filled with the warm fuzzies over their good deed, fly away. As they leave, they decide to watch a once-in-a-billion-year multi-dimensional eclipse which is happening nearby. The Prosilicans did exactly what one might expect. They harnessed the power of the atom, and their civilization took great strides forward. But not all of the Prosilicans wanted to use this newfound power for peace. Some wanted to use it to destroy their enemies. Uatu seemingly blames this on the Prosilicans in saying, "But it seems their ethics did not match their science." But how is this not the fault of the Watchers? They gave them guidance on science, but not on ethics. They were the ones who showed up and bragged about how great nuclear technology was without explaining its downside or taking into consideration who they were giving the technology to. What had been small, warring factions were now capable of taking out entire cities at once, and soon nuclear war had spread to every continent on the planet. The Watchers arrived to their eclipse in time to see two different dimensions of time and space pass each other. I have no idea what all that really means, but the Watchers seem impressed. On the way back home, they pass close enough to Prosilica to see what has happened. Much to their chagrin, the entire civilization appears to have been wiped out. They wonder aloud what power could have caused it. Some survivors arrive pointing fingers and calling the Watchers monsters for giving them the demonic force of nuclear energy. Doing so wiped them out. They then cursed the Watchers till the end of their days. Uatu has such a noble response. "You fools! The Prosilicans were supposed to only use nuclear energy for good stuff. How dare they be so stupid to attack each other with it?" Yet, Uatu blames them. This is like handing a group of kids a gun and then blaming the kids when one gets shot. Ikor seemingly looks on in horror at his son, while Emnu rubs salt in the wounds, pointing out that while he was being belittled for being selfish, their generosity is what caused this disaster, and thus also countering Uatu's narrative of blaming the Prosilicans. Ikor calls out, admitting that the mistake was his. Prosilicans didn't have the intellect or moral fiber to use such enormous power responsibly. Ikor admits that it was he that brought on this harm. I think this idea is great, as it really plays around with Stan Lee's idea of with great power comes great responsibility. We see Ikor suffering as he takes on the responsibility of his actions, while acknowledging that he gave incredible power to those who weren't ready for that level of responsibility. Then, because of his mistake, Ikor announces that as punishment for this appalling deed, he vows that from this day on, his people will never interfere with any other beings in the universe. We will become a race of watchers, observing and recording, but never taking part in the affairs of others. Uatu follows this moment up with, and since that fateful day, many eons ago, we who know the secret of virtual immortality, we who are the most advanced, the most civilized in all the galaxy, we have been a race of watchers. Thus have we ever been. Thus shall we ever be. For such is our destiny. And we need to note that what Uatu says here, that they have ever been watchers, that just isn't true. We just heard their backstory. And that brings me to my next point. I have used the phrase watcher or watchers throughout this entire video, but there was no such thing as a watcher prior to this story. Their race did not watch. They were actors within the universe. I think it's interesting that the Watchers must have had a name prior to being the Watchers, and they who recorded all, to my knowledge, have never shared that piece of history. They have never shared their real name. I would also like to point out that Uatu, in his constant breaking of the oath, as he does time and time again, is particularly egregious, since the oath of non-interference was taken as a punishment for their deeds against the Prosilicans. Uatu is only second to Ikor when it comes to personal responsibility, as he backed his father and pushed Ikor's proposal to share technology with other species, and as far as we are shown, Uatu was alone in stifling the opposition. To me, based on Uatu's backing of his father throughout the issue, followed by his desire to blame the Prosilicans for their self-destruction, as opposed to his father and Emnu's assessment that they were to blame, and then coupled with Uatu's continuing interference in events, culminating in his trial, I think it is fair to say that Uatu did not agree with his father's punishment for their people. As if in an expression of that inner rage come out, the next issue begins with Uatu in a rare burst of rage. We see him railing against his oath, complaining that he can't act or take part in the universe, and calling his punishment a curse. And again, I think that puts into perspective, if Uatu saw this as a just punishment for something he and his people did wrong, he wouldn't rail against it as he does here. As the Watcher recounts the previous month's events, we see a panel where, again, the Watcher promises all of the good that will come with nuclear energy without warning about any of the bad stuff. Uatu himself pushes it over the line when he claims nuclear energy will transform your civilization into a utopia. This is in Uatu's own recounting of events. And I also have to take issue with the way that Uatu is portrayed in this issue, following the destruction of the Prosilicans. We see him with his head in his hands, claiming that he and his father caused this, but in the previous issue we saw Uatu blaming the Prosilicans, but maybe it's a sign that he is taking some form of personal responsibility. To add more weight to what I was saying before about Uatu not being happy with his father's proclamation, right afterwards he says to his father, "But what if I find an alien people in serious trouble? Can I use my superior powers to help them?" And the answer is clear. His father gives him a bold-faced exclamated no. They cannot interfere, no matter how dire the circumstances seem. Often, I am very critical of Uatu for breaking his oath, as it feels it goes against the grain of the character. But I think it's important to see Uatu not as a one-dimensional being and just a watcher, but as an individual who has a history. And I'm guilty of ignoring some of that. And I don't know this, but I feel it that in this character, Stan Lee was attempting to create a character that would occasionally break the rules for the betterment of all. A character that thought it was okay to disagree with his culture, to not listen to what he was told was the right and proper way to do things. A character who was willing to cross the line for the greater good. And when I start to think about Uatu like that and how it colors in every single reaction he takes after that, a character that when given the choice between following an order and doing the right thing, Uatu chooses to do the right thing and still takes responsibility for it later. And I can respect a character like that. This story follows a defining moment in Uatu's life. For centuries, Uatu watched without interfering, and one day he ran across a planet in distress. I think it's hilarious that once Uatu lands, the problem the planet is having is they have run out of places to put their radioactive waste. They don't think that shooting it out into space and possibly exposing others to their dangerous waste is a responsible way to handle it. I think it's funny because once again, we are seeing the problems with nuclear power. What the Watchers had previously sold as the end-all, be-all of good ideas. The aliens decide to take a chance on another world being exposed to their poison, and that's the risk that they feel they have to take to ensure their own survival. So the aliens do just that. They send forth all their nuclear waste at once, knowing it will decimate life if it happens to land on an inhabited world. To ensure this doesn't happen, they aim the mass towards the most deserted part of the galaxy they can find, and once that mass is sent away, the aliens forget about it. But Uatu, the Watcher, he watches. Decades later, Uatu watches as the radioactive cloud passes harmlessly through space, but then it approaches a group of inhabited planets. The Watcher finds himself, after all these centuries, at a crossroads. He could easily destroy the cloud and go home, thus saving millions, or he can watch as a world dies. Uatu bemoans and complains about his position, and as he does so, a decision is reached by Uatu out of respect for his father. Again, not due to accepting his personal responsibility about what happened to the Prosilicans, but out of respect for his father, Uatu decides to stay his hand. As he watches and wallows in despair, a bright flash of light catches him off guard. A nearby star has exploded in a supernova. In doing so, one of its planets is hurled out of orbit. This rogue planet is headed towards the uninhabited galaxy, and when it strikes, it will destroy all life not just on that one planet, but in the entire galaxy. But then, what do you know? The giant radioactive cloud creeps forth. The two strike each other, causing a planetary-scale atomic event. Both the radioactive cloud and the planet end in mutual annihilation. Two threats canceled each other out. Uatu smiles, pleased with himself. If he had destroyed the radioactive cloud to save a planet like he wanted, then he would have been weakened and unable to stop the oncoming planet, and thus the entire galaxy would have been destroyed. By listening to his father and not interfering, he saved an entire galaxy's population. And man, do I hate the fact that Stan Lee ends the story on this particular note. My father was right. He knew that in their own mysterious way, the fates always know best. That is why I must never interfere with them, why I must do no more than look and listen and record. Seemingly, the watcher learns a valuable lesson here, which begs the question, why is the character continuously written as interfering for over a decade before we get to the trial of the Watcher story. And even then, most of those times that he's interfering are stories that are written by Stan Lee. And even after that, the Watcher still continues to do far more than just look, listen, and record. I feel like Stan Lee would have done the character more justice by having watched the civilization get destroyed. Then we might better understand why he chooses to break his oath later. Or on the other side of that, have him interfere and actually save things and have this be a watershed moment for him. But as this story stands, what it shows is that he should have faith enough in the universe that things will work out without him having to go and stick his nose into things, without him having to interfere. And I could understand if it was other writers within Marvel who wrote the Watcher this way. But there aren't. Those early Watcher stories are written almost exclusively by Stan Lee. This isn't brought to any kind of conclusion until 1975's Trial of the Watcher. In Captain Marvel, Volume 1, issues number 37 through 39, which I cover at the link above. I wish I had read this story before I had made that video, as I would have played up Emnu's rivalry a little bit more. It does seem fitting that he would lead those proceedings. Another idea in here that really doesn't fit in and ties this story up is the idea of the fates, that there is some larger force greater than the Watchers who are guiding all things. But I'm not really quite sure what the fates are in the context. I love any story that gives us insights to the inner workings of Watcher society. It's something we get to see very, very seldom. So far from the stories I've covered, we've seen that they have governing bodies, they have trials, they have dads, and seemingly legacies. Are they really that much different than us? I hope you enjoyed this look into the first telling of the origins of the Watcher. Thanks for watching Cosmic Comics. Feel free to hit any of the buttons below. I'm out.